Hollywood sold dreams to the world, fame, money, and immortality on screen. But behind the premieres and spotlights, another power moved quietly. Gangsters did not write scripts or direct films. They controlled unions, nightclubs, money, and leverage. This is not a movie myth. These are the documented moments when the Mafia crossed into Hollywood and left fingerprints that never fully disappeared. Frank Sinatra was born in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1915, the son of Italian immigrants. By the late 1930s, he was a skinny kid with a microphone, singing first with the Harry James Orchestra and then with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. His voice made him famous quickly. It also made people suspicious. Almost as soon as his career took off, rumors followed him. Rumors that said his rise was helped by more than talent alone. Those rumors reflected the world Sinatra was moving through. In the 1930s and 1940s, nightlife was not a clean business. Nightclubs, booking agencies, and labor unions were often influenced by organized crime, especially in major cities. This was not unique to Sinatra. Many performers depended on venues and unions that existed in a gray zone, where legitimate entertainment and criminal influence overlapped. Being successful meant navigating that system, whether you wanted to or not. One name that repeatedly appears in accounts of Sinatra's early career is Willie Moretti, a powerful New Jersey mob figure associated with Lucky Luciano. Moretti was real, and his role in organized crime is well documented. Several journalists and biographers have written that Moretti took an interest in Sinatra early on and may have helped smooth access to clubs and promoters. What cannot be proven is the extent of that help. There are no contracts, recordings, or court records showing that Sinatra's success was engineered by the Mafia, only consistent accounts that doors sometimes opened more easily than they did for others. The most controversial episode came in 1942, when Sinatra was released from his contract with Tommy Dorsey. Dorsey was known as a hard negotiator who rarely let singers walk away. Sinatra later said he paid a financial settlement to secure his release. Others hinted that pressure may have been applied behind the scenes. According to long-standing rumors repeated by contemporaries and later writers, men connected to organized crime may have encouraged Dorsey to change his mind. No police report was filed, no charges were brought, and no proof has ever surfaced. The story survives because it fits the era, not because it was ever confirmed. Decades later, these rumors took on new life when author Mario Puzo used a similar scenario in The Godfather. The character Johnny Fontane, a singer whose career is helped by mob pressure, was widely interpreted as being inspired in part by Sinatra. Sinatra publicly denied the connection and was furious about it. Puzo never stated that the character was a direct portrait. What mattered was that the story felt believable to audiences familiar with how the entertainment business once worked. When Sinatra moved into Hollywood in the late 1940s, his career faltered. His comeback came in 1953 with From Here to Eternity. Once again, rumors claimed mob influence helped secure the role. This time, the record is clearer. Journalists and FBI investigations found no evidence of threats or coercion. Studio executives stated that Sinatra earned the part through auditions and persistence. In this case, the Mafia story appears to be myth rather than fact. What is verifiable is this: Sinatra maintained friendships with men who were later identified as organized crime figures. He attended private gatherings, defended friends who were eventually convicted of serious crimes, and used his influence to help people he was loyal to. The FBI kept a file on him for years. They never charged him with a crime. They never proved he was part of organized crime. What they documented was proximity, loyalty, and access. Frank Sinatra's career was built on talent, timing, and relentless ambition. It also unfolded in an era when power did not always announce itself openly. Organized crime did not make him famous, but it shaped the environment he had to move through. That shadow followed him for the rest of his life, not as a conviction, but as a question that history never fully closed. Mickey Cohen was born in Brooklyn in 1913 and came up through the Jewish underworld before heading west. By the late 1930s, Los Angeles was changing rapidly. The film industry was booming, nightclubs were multiplying, and organized crime saw opportunity. Cohen arrived in California as an enforcer and bookmaker closely associated with Bugsy Siegel, who had been sent west to expand gambling and racketeering interests tied to East Coast syndicates. These connections are well documented in law enforcement records and contemporary reporting. After Siegel was murdered in Beverly Hills in 1947, Cohen emerged as one of the men who took over significant parts of his former operation. Unlike many mob figures, Cohen sought attention rather than avoiding it. He dressed flamboyantly, courted reporters, and inserted himself into Hollywood's social scene. This was not rumor. Newspapers, police files, and court testimony from the period consistently describe Cohen as a public figure who wanted to be seen and photographed alongside celebrities. Cohen cultivated relationships with actors, musicians, and athletes. He was publicly associated with figures such as Frank Sinatra, Jerry Lewis, and Sammy Davis Jr. Photographs and eyewitness accounts confirm that these men were seen together socially. What is less clear is the nature of those relationships. Some celebrities later described them as casual or unavoidable encounters. Others suggested Cohen offered a sense of protection in a city where extortion, blackmail, and tabloid pressure were genuine concerns. Motive remains debated, but the associations themselves are not. That protection was backed by real power. During the 1940s and early 1950s, Cohen controlled bookmakers, employed violent enforcers, and benefited from corruption within the Los Angeles Police Department, a problem later exposed through internal investigations and grand jury proceedings. Multiple witnesses testified that club owners who resisted Cohen's demands were threatened or assaulted. Some were beaten, others were forced out of business. These actions are supported by sworn testimony and official records, not later mythology. Hollywood nightlife was part of that ecosystem. Celebrities frequented clubs where Cohen exerted influence, including venues like the Macambo and Ciro's. Cohen did not usually appear as an owner on paper, but witnesses later stated that his men provided security, collected payments, and enforced decisions about which clubs operated freely and which did not. Stars were not running these places. They were guests in spaces where Cohen's authority was understood. Cohen's relationship with the press helped shape his image. He gave interviews, posed for photographs, and portrayed himself as a businessman and a patriot. Behind that image was sustained violence. He survived multiple assassination attempts, including a car bombing outside his home in 1950 that seriously injured him. Police records confirm the bombing and connect it to internal, organized crime conflicts rather than personal disputes. Federal pressure eventually ended his reign. Unlike many mob figures, Cohen was not convicted for murder or violent racketeering. In 1961, he was convicted of tax evasion, a charge frequently used when other crimes proved harder to prosecute. Court records show that financial evidence, not celebrity ties or Hollywood connections, was central to the case. He served several years in federal prison and never regained his former influence. What can be verified is this: Mickey Cohen did not control Hollywood, but he controlled parts of the nightlife Hollywood relied on. He intimidated club owners, maintained relationships with celebrities, and used fear as leverage in an industry built on access and image. Movie stars were not his partners. They were part of the environment he operated in, sometimes by choice, sometimes by caution. Los Angeles in that era allowed a man like Cohen to thrive. The boundary between glamour and organized crime was thin, and he crossed it openly. His celebrity associations were real, his criminal record was real, and the harm he caused did not exist only in headlines or photographs. It remains preserved in court transcripts, police files, and the businesses he dismantled along the way. By the time Hollywood began making serious films about organized crime, the Mafia was no longer a hidden influence. It was a subject. That shift mattered because it changed how criminals interacted with filmmakers. What followed was not a pattern of intimidation behind studio gates, but something more transactional and, in most cases, documented. When Martin Scorsese made Goodfellas, The film was based on the non-fiction book Wise Guy by Nicholas Pileggi. Pileggi's primary source was Henry Hill, a real associate of the Lucchese crime family who entered the Witness Protection Program in 1980. Hill cooperated extensively with federal authorities, and his criminal activities were established through court records and sworn testimony. During the adaptation process, Hill served as an informal consultant, offering clarification on dialogue, routines, and day-to-day practices that had already been described publicly or under oath. There is no evidence that Hill threatened the production or attempted to exert pressure. Interviews with Scorsese, Pileggi, and studio representatives consistently describe Hill's involvement as voluntary and informational. Law enforcement agencies were aware of his cooperation with the film and raised no objections. His role reflected consultation, not leverage. A similar process occurred with Casino, also written by Pileggi and directed by Scorsese. The film drew heavily from documented Chicago outfit operations in Las Vegas, particularly the Stardust and Fremont casinos. One of the consultants was Frank Carlotta, a former enforcer for Tony Spilotro. Carlotta had already become a government witness and had testified in federal cases related to casino skimming and organized crime in Nevada. Carlotta openly acknowledged advising the filmmakers on violence, burglary methods, and mob hierarchy. His participation is confirmed through interviews, his memoir, and records connected to his cooperation with federal authorities. Like Hill, Carlotta no longer held criminal power. His credibility depended on transparency, and his role was advisory rather than coercive. Claims that active mafia figures intimidated studios or producers to get the story right are far less solid. Journalists and historians who have reviewed studio correspondence, court files, and law enforcement records have found no verified cases of threats tied to Goodfellas or Casino. No police reports document intimidation. No producers testified to coercion. What does exist are anecdotes repeated years later, often without sourcing, where consultation is retroactively framed as control. That distinction matters. Real criminals did influence how these films were shaped, but they did so after their authority was gone. They were no longer enforcing street power. They were supplying information, sometimes for compensation, sometimes for relevance, sometimes because Hollywood offered a form of legacy they could not secure elsewhere. Studios accepted this help because accuracy carried weight. Filmmakers like Scorsese were known for cross-checking accounts against court transcripts, surveillance records, and multiple witnesses. When details could not be corroborated, they were altered, compressed, or removed. That method is visible in both films, where realism serves the story but does not replace evidence. There is no dispute that organized crime figures influenced the texture of these movies. There is also no verified proof that active mafia intimidation shaped major studio crime films of this era. The influence came from former criminals whose power had already been stripped away by the justice system and converted into testimony. The irony is that the Mafia did not control these films. The record did. Court transcripts, FBI files, and sworn statements determined what survived onto the screen. Hollywood was not answering to the mob, it was answering to documentation. When The Godfather was published in 1969 and later adapted for the screen, readers and viewers quickly focused on one character who felt uncomfortably familiar. Johnny Fontane was a successful singer whose career stalled until a powerful mafia figure intervened and pressured a studio executive to reverse a decision. The resemblance to existing Hollywood rumors was obvious, and almost immediately, the character was publicly linked to Frank Sinatra. Johnny Fontane was a fictional character, but by that point the rumors surrounding Sinatra were already well known. Sinatra had acknowledged friendships with men later identified as organized crime figures, and he moved in social circles where entertainment and criminal influence overlapped. Those facts were part of the public record long before Puzo's novel appeared. As a result, many readers and viewers interpreted Fontane as a reflection of those stories, whether or not that was the author's intent. Mario Puzo repeatedly denied that Johnny Fontane was a direct portrait of Sinatra. In interviews, Puzo stated that the character was a composite, shaped by multiple performers and by the broader power dynamics of the entertainment industry during the mid-20th century. He acknowledged being aware of the Sinatra rumors but insisted he was writing about a system, not an individual, and that Fontane was never meant as a one-to-one representation. Sinatra rejected that explanation. Journalists who covered him closely reported that he was deeply angered by the comparison. Several biographies and second-hand accounts describe Sinatra confronting Puzo privately and expressing outrage over what he believed was a damaging insinuation. These accounts are consistent in tone but vary in detail. There is no recording, no sworn testimony, and no contemporaneous police or court record. What is widely agreed upon is the intensity of Sinatra's reaction, not the specifics of any confrontation. What can be verified is Sinatra's public position. He openly denied any resemblance between himself and Johnny Fontane and dismissed the idea that his career had been advanced through intimidation or criminal pressure. His associates echoed that denial. He never filed a lawsuit against Puzo or the studio, and no legal action followed. The dispute remained cultural and personal rather than judicial. The speculation endured because it aligned with a narrative many people already believed. Sinatra's documented proximity to organized crime figures made the fictional scenario feel plausible, even without evidence. Puzo's inclusion of a dramatic studio coercion scene reinforced that perception, despite the absence of proof connecting Sinatra to anything resembling the novel's infamous horsehead episode. Over time, the Johnny Fontane debate became part of the mythology surrounding both Sinatra and The Godfather. It persisted through interviews, biographies, and repeated retellings. It was sustained by denial on one side and ambiguity on the other. What it was never supported by was definitive proof. Johnny Fontane remains a fictional character. Sinatra was never charged with any crime related to the allegations implied by the story. The overlap exists in rumor, reputation, and the historical reality that Hollywood and organized crime once shared the same social world. That environment produced stories people were prepared to believe, whether the evidence supported them or not. Benjamin Siegel was born in Brooklyn in 1906 and became known early as a violent figure within New York's Jewish underworld. By the mid-1930s, he was closely aligned with Meyer Lansky and operated within the broader criminal network associated with Lucky Luciano. When the National Syndicate expanded its interests westward, Siegel was sent to California as part of that effort. He did not attempt to stay invisible. He arrived with money, reputation, and a preference for being seen. By the early 1940s, Siegel was living in Beverly Hills and moving openly within Hollywood social circles. Police intelligence files, contemporary newspaper reporting, and later congressional testimony place him repeatedly in Los Angeles high society. He rented and later owned expensive homes, attended industry gatherings, and socialized with producers, agents, and actors. This was not covert infiltration, it was proximity. Hollywood at the time was relatively small, socially insular, and drawn to people who projected confidence and risk. Siegel fit easily into that world. Siegel's personal life added to his visibility. He maintained a long and volatile relationship with Virginia Hill, a woman whose involvement with organized crime logistics is documented in law enforcement files. Hill was identified by investigators as a courier and intermediary who moved money between California, Chicago, and East Coast syndicate figures. She appeared frequently in Hollywood nightlife and was often photographed with Siegel at clubs and social events. Her presence reinforced Siegel's image as a glamorous figure, even though his income was derived from criminal activity. What can be verified is that Siegel benefited from Hollywood as a social shield. Being seen alongside actors and industry figures allowed him to cultivate the appearance of legitimacy and distracted from the nature of his operations. Early press coverage often described him as a wealthy gambler or nightclub personality before openly labeling him a mob figure. That image offered temporary insulation. Behind it, Siegel was involved in illegal gambling, extortion, and labor-related rackets, activities reflected in police intelligence summaries and later federal investigations. Claims that Siegel used film studios as recruiting grounds are not supported by the record. There is no sworn testimony, no reliable law enforcement documentation, and no contemporaneous reporting showing that he attempted to recruit criminals through the movie industry or convert actors into operatives. What the evidence does show is that Siegel recruited within existing criminal networks and used Hollywood connections primarily to enhance his public image, not to build manpower. Assertions beyond that move from documentation into speculation. By the mid-1940s, Siegel's primary focus had shifted to Las Vegas. He became the central figure behind the Flamingo Hotel project, which was financed largely with syndicate funds from the East Coast. Persistent construction delays, ballooning costs, and unaccounted-for money raised serious concerns among his partners. Those concerns were later described by federal investigators reviewing internal syndicate communications. On June 20th, 1947, Siegel was shot and killed while sitting in the Beverly Hills home of Virginia Hill. The murder was never officially solved, but law enforcement and historians broadly agree it was an authorized mob killing connected to the Flamingo Project and the loss of syndicate money. No Hollywood figures were implicated. His death marked the abrupt end of his effort to live openly among celebrities. Bugsy Siegel did not control Hollywood, and he did not corrupt the film industry from within. What he did was blur the boundary between criminal power and celebrity culture at a moment when both were drawn to visibility and excess. He lived in Hollywood, he socialized there, he exploited its glamour. The crimes that defined him, however, remained rooted in organized crime, not in the movie business. By the middle of the 20th century, the Mafia did not need to threaten movie stars to exert pressure on Hollywood. Control of labor was far more effective. Film production depended on unions, and several of those unions were compromised by organized crime influence. This was not speculation. It was established through federal investigations, Senate hearings, and criminal prosecutions. The most powerful labor organization in the country was the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. While the Teamsters were not a film union, they controlled trucking, transportation, and logistics nationwide. In an industry dependent on moving sets, equipment, and film stock, that leverage mattered. Under the leadership of Jimmy Hoffa, the union became deeply entangled with organized crime figures connected to Detroit, Chicago, and New York. Federal investigations later demonstrated that Mafia leaders exploited Teamsters pension funds to finance casinos, hotels, and large construction projects, particularly in Las Vegas. Some of those projects later intersected with entertainment and tourism infrastructure, though the pension fund itself was not shown to directly control film production. Inside Hollywood, the most vulnerable union was the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, known as IATSE. During the 1930s and 1940s, elements of IATSE leadership were compromised by organized crime figures, especially those linked to Chicago and West Coast rackets. This was exposed during the 1947 Hollywood labor hearings and reinforced during the Kefauver Senate investigations in the early 1950s. Testimony and financial records showed that certain union officials accepted bribes, enforced favorable contracts, and relied on intimidation to maintain power. The leverage this created was practical rather than dramatic. A strike could halt a production instantly, crews could be withdrawn, equipment deliveries could be delayed, sets could remain idle, while studios absorbed massive financial losses. Producers understood that disputes with compromised union leadership could stall or destroy a project. In that environment, negotiation and accommodation were often seen as safer than confrontation. There is no verified evidence that Mafia leaders dictated casting choices or creative decisions on major studio films. That claim appears frequently in popular law but is not supported by court records, sworn testimony, or federal findings. What is documented is economic pressure. Studios dealt with compromised unions to keep productions moving. Organized crime benefited from leverage and stability, not from artistic control. Federal scrutiny eventually exposed the system. Testimony from union members, financial audits, and investigative reporting revealed how organized crime figures skimmed union funds, extorted payments, and enforced loyalty through threats. Several union officials were indicted, removed, or forced out. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, prosecutions and reforms significantly weakened organized crime's influence over Hollywood labor. The Mafia's role in film production did not resemble the movies it later inspired. There were no sit-downs on sound stages and no producers dragged into alleys. The influence operated through contracts, delays, and the constant risk of financial disruption. That form of control generated fewer headlines, but it left a clear trail in government records. Hollywood survived it. The unions survived it. What remains is a documented reminder that organized crime did not need creative authority to shape the industry. It only needed leverage. Johnny Roselli was born Filippo Sacco in Esperia, Italy, in 1905 and later grew up in Chicago, where organized crime shaped much of the city's underworld. By the 1930s, Roselli was a trusted associate of the Chicago outfit, working within networks tied first to Al Capone and later to Tony Accardo. Unlike street-level enforcers, Roselli's value lay in discretion. He was articulate, well-dressed, and understood how criminal money flowed through legitimate businesses. That made him especially useful in environments where visibility was a liability. Roselli relocated to Los Angeles in the late 1930s as the outfit expanded its interests on the West Coast. He did not arrive as a public figure. He embedded himself quietly into the business side of Hollywood, not as a producer or studio executive, but as an intermediary. Law enforcement intelligence files and later Senate testimony describe him as a fixer who handled labor problems, business disputes, and sensitive financial arrangements that studios preferred not to formalize. He did not control Hollywood. He operated within it, selectively and with care. One of Roselli's most consistently documented roles involved labor racketeering. Federal investigators later established that he acted as a liaison between the Chicago outfit and compromised Hollywood unions, particularly those tied to set construction, transportation, and logistics. Intelligence reports frequently noted his presence when labor disputes were abruptly resolved or productions resumed after unexplained delays. Roselli did not appear on contracts or payrolls. His role was informal, which was precisely the point. Roselli's proximity to power extended beyond studios. He cultivated relationships with wealthy and influential figures who valued discretion. Among them was Howard Hughes. Roselli's association with Hughes is confirmed through FBI surveillance records and later congressional testimony. The relationship revolved around business introductions, access, and problem-solving, not creative collaboration. Hughes sought intermediaries who operated quietly. Roselli fit that role. The most extraordinary chapter of Roselli's life emerged years later, when his name surfaced in classified government operations. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Roselli was recruited through intermediaries connected to the Central Intelligence Agency to assist in plots aimed at assassinating Cuban leader Fidel Castro. These efforts relied on Roselli's underworld contacts and experience. The existence of the plots was publicly confirmed during the Church Committee hearings in the mid-1970s. Roselli testified under oath. The historical record is unambiguous. Organized crime figures were used as assets in Cold War intelligence operations. Roselli's influence in Hollywood was never about celebrity. He avoided publicity and was rarely photographed. His value came from access and trust. Studios did not employ him, they tolerated his presence. The outfit did not promote him, they depended on him. That balance allowed him to operate for decades without becoming widely known. His life ended violently. In 1976, Roselli disappeared. Months later, his body was found inside a steel drum floating in Dumfoundling Bay near Miami. He had been strangled. Law enforcement investigators concluded that the killing was likely ordered by organized crime figures who feared Roselli might disclose sensitive information to federal authorities. No one was ever charged. Johnny Roselli was not a studio boss and not a celebrity hanger-on. he was something more effective. He was a quiet operator at the intersection of organized crime and legitimate business. Hollywood did not know his name, the people who mattered did.